Good afternoon and welcome to Invex Therapeutics presentation at the NWR Conference. Invex is focused on the repurposing of an already approved drug, exenatide, for efficacious treatment of neurological conditions. It's focused on treating conditions derived from or involving raised intracranial pressure, such as IIH, acute stroke, and traumatic brain injury. Invex has trademarked its repurposed exenatide as Presendin. Following a successful phase 2 clinical trial in May of this year, the company expects to progress into a phase 3 registration study in IIH early next year. Presenting from the company today, we have Executive Director, Dr. Tom Duthy. He has more than 15 years of direct financial markets experience, having worked in sell-side equity research and senior executive roles across investor relations and corporate development. He's the founder and CEO of Enimin Group, a boutique corporate advisor and investor relations firm specialising in delivering value-added services across the life science, medical devices, healthcare tech, and emerging companies, including Certex Medical. For those on the line, if you just want to join in terms of asking questions via the Q&A box down the bottom, and we'll ensure we get to them. But Tom, I'll hand over to you to get started.
Great, thanks very much, and appreciate everyone's time this morning or this afternoon, wherever you are. So just a disclaimer before I commence the presentation deck in earnest. Just a company snapshot on Invex. We effectively are a biopharmaceutical development company with a repurposed proven drug, generic name exenatide, branded name Presendin. And our clinical stage of development, we are, as alluded to, we're entering phase 3 clinical trials first half of next calendar year. We have a resolute focus on an indication called idiopathic intracranial hypertension, or IIH, which I'll come to a little bit later in the deck. And we have orphan designations granted in the United States and Europe. On our numbers, and again, we'll come to this, we believe that market is worth annually about 1.6 billion in the United States and Europe. And we really see the valuation drivers for this business in terms of growing both our market capitalization and our enterprise value will ultimately relate to our clinical development and success, our regulatory iterations and progression, and build out of our patent suite for this very interesting repurposing opportunity. Market cap currently is about 64 million. We have 34 million in cash with an enterprise value, which we think offers reasonable value for investors here, of 30 million. Directors and management own a reasonable chunk of the business. Tattarang is our largest institutional holder, which is part of the Andrew Forrest Foundation, formerly known as Minderoo. And our top 20 owns about 64%. I recently joined the board around 3 or 4 weeks ago, but the board of directors is comprised of very skilled, seasoned pharmaceutical executives, as well as the leading IIH researcher and clinician globally, and a co-founder of the business, Professor Alex Sinclair. To give you some dynamics on the opportunity for Invex, the IIH total addressable market, as I mentioned, is not only large, but it's also growing reasonably healthily at 3.4% per annum. For a company like Invex, a small little company in Australia, it's a completely unencumbered drug therapy market opportunity. So there's no approved treatments for IIH, nor are there any new treatments like exenatide, for example, currently in mid to late stage clinical trials. So that's an attractive market. Also, there's a dire and urgent market need from the patient perspective. If Alex was on the call, who runs the largest IIH clinic in the United Kingdom, would tell you these patients are not well treated currently. And more particularly, their disease manifests as a chronic disease over many years in cases. And therefore, as a drug therapy, we offer chronic administration if ultimately approved. We also have developed, I think, very supportive clinical data of our drug exenatide, which showed clear statistical and clinical evidence of efficacy, and met both primary and secondary endpoints in a phase 2 study, which I'll come to. There was no safety concerns of any major concern, and as mentioned, we plan to start a study next calendar year, first half. If you look at the market itself and think about what are the kinds of barriers for competition in this market that we ourselves have established with both orphan drug designation in the United States and Europe, that provides us with 7 to 10 years respectively of market exclusivity. We've also received issued patents in Japan, notice of allowance in the US, and pending patents elsewhere on the use of exenatide in IIH. So a very good suite of intellectual property, both legislative derived by orphan, but also patent derived by Invex. So what is IIH? Very simply, it's a disease of overweight women of childbearing age. So around 90% of the market is exactly that demographic. The idiopathic nature of the disease means we don't really know what causes it. The incidence is mentioned there is low, which makes it an orphan disease. But these women suffer, terribly from the manifestations of their disease, with over 90% having, progressively worse and more severe and more frequent headaches, and that's a major cause of morbidity. And I guess scarily, these patients suffer, 25% of them suffer permanent vision loss through the elevation of intracranial pressure and the effects of intracranial pressure in the brain on the optic nerve. So compression of that nerve will ultimately kill the nerve, and they'll lose vision accordingly. I will just preface what I've just said by saying that the increase in pressure these patients exhibit is a function of the overproduction of something called cerebral spinal fluid, which is the fluid that nourishes your brain along your spinal cord. And our drug specifically and scientifically interacts with the receptors that produce CSF in the brain. The impact for these patients, unfortunately, is rather profound as well. For those who have severe IIH, the only intervention is a surgical or a device intervention, and that's manifests in two ways. Firstly, a shunt that's placed in the back of the brain that collectively drains fluid, and that's one approach. The second approach is a vision sparing procedure, where they basically remove the sheath of the optic nerve, and that's called a fenestration procedure undertaken by an ophthalmologist. So highly invasive, lots of side effects. These patients are a relatively high burden on the healthcare system through hospital admissions, a duration of hospital stay of around 3 days, and the costs of IIH are rising in an incredibly high manner, a 5-fold increase according to one UK study undertaken by Susan Molan and colleagues, and the cost just in the UK is expected to be £460 million. So what we as a company are doing to kind of address these issues and this need, both market need and patient need, is that our CSO and Executive Director, Alex, was the first to demonstrate that a glucagon-like peptide receptor agonist, which are currently used as a standard in diabetes treatment, and that is exenatide. These formulations are known as Byetta and Bydureon. This peptide exenatide acts, or these agonists will act on the choroid plexus in the brain, which are the group of epithelial cells that basically are responsible for cerebral spinal fluid secretion. So by lowering cerebral spinal fluid secretion, by consequence, we should be able to lower intracranial pressure. And this is very well demonstrated in a whole raft of animal models undertaken by Alex and colleagues. So we think, well, in fact, we know we have a very strong scientific basis for this disease based on exenatide's effects scientifically. So it's a well-defined mechanism of action. We have our patent secured, and now it's really a case of, what does this work in humans, which I'll show you we believe it does, but secondly, how we will reformulate this drug to make it more patient-friendly and ultimately receive approvals. So our phase 2 study, we have shown for the first time a demonstration of the efficacy, which I'll come to. So I've mentioned that the current treatments for IIH are limited, and if we call out on this diagram here, this is from treatment guidelines, which in fact were written for IIH by Professor Alex Sinclair and colleagues. So we do know that these guidelines they tend to be quite assiduously followed by practicing clinicians, and so beneficially for Presendin, exenatide, and Invex. Collectively, if we were ultimately to receive a market clearance, we would envisage that our drug, having been cleared and approved for this disease, would be very rapidly accepted as a standard. So the green box there on the left-hand side, which stipulates consider acetazolamide, That is the only drug therapy where it's considered, but it's not proven to show an effect in IAH, and it has reasonably significant side effects that see about 50% of patients discontinue it. So from a market perspective, we see Presendin slotting quite nicely into the acetazolamide box there. And I mentioned that for more progressive disease, we have the effect of your major surgery, and it's transient in nature as well. Our TAM, 1.6 billion. How do we get to the TAM? I think we've developed a sequencing model here that is both referenceable and defendable, but also conservatively driven. So in the United States and Europe, we have around 40,000 patients. Interestingly for this disease, and this probably and could ultimately add to TAM, but 40% of these patients actually don't know they have IAH, quite scarily. So of those that are diagnosed, we do know that they are drug treatable. We do know that on average, they have the disease for 4.3 years, but we believe, again, they probably have it, when in fact they do have it a lot longer than that. That's principally a function of just a discontinuation of clinician visits and monitoring of their disease. So if we take, kind of the overall prevalence of this disease, and then we overlay how we think about it this early stage, at least how we'll price Presendin at $1,500 a month, we get to our TAM. I might add that pricing metric is clearly subject to change, and it's been based off a 2 times uplift on the current branded exenatide product called Byetta. In truth, repurposed orphan drugs, and we've referenced that, can command up to 66 times the pricing of the reference drug. One of the things we're often asked is, okay, if I have IAH, who's going to guard and lead me down my journey of this disease? And typically the gatekeepers for diagnosis do tend to be optometrists. So patients who first notice they may have an issue tend to notice it in their vision. Headaches are not typically something the patient thinks of IAH immediately, clearly. And so the optometrist will then refer these patients, when there's suspect imaging of the optic nerve, to ophthalmologists. And it's a very esoteric group of ophthalmologists that treat IAH patients. There's only around 260 in the United States, and they are neuro-ophthalmologists. So they're the first group of specialist clinicians. The second group is neurologists, and the reason neurologists get involved and why they work well in unison with the neuro-ophthalmologists is the disease manifests in over 90% of patients as intractable, progressive, and severe headaches. And so we know from a targeting perspective, what's attractive about this market is we're not talking about tens of thousands of disparate specialty groups. They're actually quite concentrated. So that's good from a marketing perspective. Our phase 2 trial, this study was completed in the second quarter of this calendar year, and really for the first time showed that exenatide, i.e. a GLP-1 receptor agonist, can lower intracranial pressure in humans. And that's a major leap forward, both scientifically and from Invex's perspective, developmentally, as we now have something that we can take to the regulators to progress through the clinical trial gamut. In summary, we met the primary endpoint of pressure being lowered in these patients relative to placebo, and we met secondary endpoints on headache and vision, which I'll come to, and these were both met in a statistically significant and clinically meaningful way. This drug has been used in millions of diabetic patients globally, so we did not expect, nor did we exhibit any safety or serious safety effects. The most common adverse event was nausea, which is quite common in diabetic patients, for example, receiving Byetta. So our conclusion from the study was that the strength of this outcome from both a primary and secondary endpoint perspective implied a clear and strong drug effect in this patient population out to 12 weeks and really supports the progression of our program into phase 3 trials. To put this schematically and diagrammatically for those on the call that appreciate and quite like science, this gives a snapshot of the results at 2.5 hours, 24 hours, and 12 weeks. The size of the study, we did pre-specify the significance level of 0.1. So on that basis, we had a strong effect, drug treatment effect on these measures. So headache days, for example, the second chart there was a 37% reduction or 7.7 days per month of headache reduced. In context of migraine drugs, that's quite a profound change, and the hurdle rate we believe would be met and therefore clinically meaningful. And importantly, and this was probably a little more unexpected, we actually saw very significant improvement in visual acuity at 12 weeks. So based on the measures undertaken by way of a logMAR assessment, this would equate to 1 line of vision improvement over 12 weeks, which again was a surprisingly good result given the limited timeline. So with these phase 2 trials in hand, we have a clear reformulation and repurposing strategy. I won't bore you with the dirty details here, but suffice to say the 2 branded exenatide products on the market are by Etta, which is a twice-a-day subcutaneous injection of exenatide, and a long-acting once-a-week formulation called Bydureon, with cumulative sales in diabetes of around 650 million. What we wish to do is to take exenatide and reformulate exenatide to a once-a-day treatment for IAH patients. Principally, we believe this offers the best possibility of generating solid efficacy, but also from a patient perspective, we believe a once-a-day dosing regimen in IAH will be better tolerated and with less side effects. And so our formulation strategy is clear. We filed patents on our reformulations in the first quarter of 2020, and I'll give you some context as to where we're at currently. So we have completed a whole testing battery of different formulations of exenatide that fit for purpose for an IAH patient. Unfortunately, we'd expected to complete and report the outcome of animal pharmacokinetic studies, which monitors how this drug operates or how this drug is metabolized and how it performs, for want of a better word, in animal models. The results we had expected in the third quarter, but unfortunately, because of access to lab personnel and lab testing facilities in Europe due to COVID-19, we haven't completed the requisite analysis work to select our preferred formulation candidate for human clinical trials, phase 3 human clinical trials. But we expect to make that formulation final this quarter. Manufacturing is clearly tied to the reformulation, and so again, for the same reason, formulation's been delayed. Therefore, manufacturing appointment of contract manufacturers to produce Presendin for us to meet the requirements of several small lead-in studies required, but also our human clinical study. We expect to be in a position to sign that off also this current quarter, which are big milestones for the company, and manufacturing is a reasonable cost and contract for the company for clinical trial purposes. We are required under the expedited timelines afforded to us under the European Medicines Agency and Food and Drug Administration as a repurposed drug and reformulated drug. We're required to look at whether our drug in its formulation form irritates or exacerbates at the injection site in animals, and that's called a tolerability study. We'll start that study first half next calendar year. We're also required to show, alongside Byetta, which is the reference drug for purposes of our development program, we need to look at how our reformulated exenatide, i.e. Presendin, how that performs in healthy, albeit obese, volunteers. So we're looking at single and repeated doses of Presendin to look at how that compares and contrasts. It is important from a regulatory perspective to move forward here without reams of further tox and safety, as you would ordinarily expect from a drug, that we need to show the amount of bioavailable drug does not exceed what's approved for exenatide in its branded form by Etta. And so again, we expect that study to be commenced in the first half of 21. The all-important regulatory update, again, I mentioned to you that following our phase 2 data, we felt we're in a very good position to progress our program into phase 3 clinical trials. And we received some initial scientific and protocol assistance response back from both the European Medicines Agency and the Food and Drug Administration in July. To give the commonality of the responses between both agencies, there was broad acceptability of our preclinical and human PK study plans between both the EMA and the FDA. Both actually assert that the reduction in headache days is a meaningful clinical endpoint. The EMA, I guess, came back with an initial piece of advice that recommended intracranial pressure as a primary endpoint versus placebo across one well-controlled study. The FDA, we offered, I guess, the option of the FDA to consider which primary endpoint, being headache or vision, that they would prefer, noting either is permissible and very standard when running ophthalmology-based or headache-based study designs. The FDA effectively asked for more information in the form of a protocol and statistical analysis plan before they'd give further feedback and consideration. And so what we're doing currently is to prepare in parallel with our second filing with the European agency looking at headache, which was made in October, assessing and once we've got the feedback from the EMA later this quarter, we will file with the FDA a request for a pre-IND meeting in the first quarter of calendar year 2021. So we want the learned experience from the EMA and their view or scientific advice on headache before we make that determination of how we progress this with the FDA, noting that the FDA accepts that headache days is a meaningful endpoint. So just in summary and our outlook for the remainder of this calendar year and into 2021, I hope today I've been able to give you some degree of confidence that IAH is not only a large and growing market, but lacks any approved medical interventions, which makes it extremely attractive for new drug developers. Moreover, we have our orphan drug designations, which give us both expedited and more cost-effective clinical designs and processes and more offsets in terms of tax incentive and filing fees with regulators. It also gives us that exclusivity period if Presendin is ultimately approved. We have strong phase 2 data. Our financials, we're in a very strong financial position. We have 34 million in cash following a capital raise tied to our phase 2 data, which was in our view a very successful capital raise so soon after listing. And presently we have, I think, a very attractive enterprise value of just 30 million relative to not only the stage we're at as a company in our developmental program, but if just taking a number of select ASX comparable companies that have both orphan programs, ophthalmic programs, or repurposing programs, we think we offer pretty good value there too. Our 12 months milestones, I've sort of been through a few of these, but quite clearly quarter 4 is an important one for Invex as we seek those consents and those results in order to move forward with our manufacturing, which ultimately then drives our human work and then obviously drives our commencement of our human clinical study in first half calendar year 2021. So with that, I'd like to hand back for Q&A. So thank you very much for your time.
Great, thanks, Tom. First question, regarding the sample size, it looks to be rather small. Could you please explain why the allocation to groups is random rather than selected to match baseline BMI and ICP? Please also comment on the large difference in baseline monthly headache days. Thank you.
Okay, so it's quite a detailed question. A lot of that information we called out in the investor presentation when the trial results were first disclosed to the ASX. So one of the confounders for the baseline headache assumptions was, I think there was one patient who recorded 0 headache days in the placebo group, which is very unusual for IAH patients generally. They do tend to have a number of headache days consistently month to month. From the perspective of the trial design and the powering and the size, one of the ethical constraints that limited the not only the randomization but also the size of the study was the fact that these patients were implanted with a transmitter, a pressure transmitter in the right lobe of their brain, and that allowed Invex and the study investigators to have 24/7 monitoring of their pressure. So why I say that's a constraint from an ethical perspective, only half the patients who consented for that neurosurgical procedure received the active drug, the other half received placebo. So that limits the number of patients. Secondly, the power to the study design that was afforded by that monitor allowed us to collect 36,000 data points per patient, which gave us the statistical power that if there was a difference in ICP, we would have seen it at those time points. And in fact, that's exactly what we did see.
Great, thanks, Tom. Next question is, to what extent is FDA likely to take EMA feedback as a guide?
I think you should always, it's nice to think that regulators tend to harmonise or pat each other on the back when it comes to clinical development, but we would see the FDA as a completely separate and targeted bucket than EMA. I guess what we're looking for in response to the EMA as requested by Invex relating to the acceptability or otherwise of headache is to harmonise the trial designs between the two regulatory bodies. And so our sort of baseline assumption with the FDA is that it's very likely that they would want a clinical measure, particularly headache. We've obviously received initial feedback from the Division of Ophthalmology, but given the collective feedback from both was headaches acceptable, what we wish to do is to take that a little bit further, and on the assumption that the EMA has headache as say acceptable for purposes of a phase 3 design, then that learned feedback I think helps us dovetail that information into any discussions with the FDA as part of a pre-IND filing and meeting request. But I wouldn't say the FDA is led by the EMA. I would say we need to prosecute the two independently. But it would be lovely to have a study that's harmonised between the two as an outcome.
Thanks, Tom. And just final question, what's the timeline for conclusion of both PK studies?
Yes, so we've completed the animal PK study. So as I mentioned, the assessment now is really getting access to those labs to actually assay the samples that we've got on those various formulation candidates. So we expect to complete that this quarter. With respect to the human PK study, again, these are not onerous studies in terms of duration, so we would expect a human PK study to be conducted over a matter of some weeks. And therefore, so our first half guidance is to commence, but clearly we would like to finish that where possible in that half as well.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. That concludes the Q&A. I'll just hand it back to you to wrap up.
Okay, well, thank you very much to NWR for hosting Invex today, and it's been a pleasure to present to you, albeit as someone relatively new at board level to the company. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and we look forward to updating the market on our progress during the remaining months of this calendar year. So thank you and have a good afternoon.
Thanks so much, Tom. Thanks everyone for joining.